June 23, 1941. Outside Raseiniai, Lithuania. Oberleutnant Hans Weber pressed his eye against the rubber cup of his Panzer III's periscope, scanning the tree line 800 meters ahead. The morning sun had burned off most of the fog, revealing the patchwork of wheat fields and scattered farmhouses that marked the Soviet frontier. Behind him, the rest of 6th Panzer Division's vanguard rumbled forward in loose formation, their tracks chewing up the dirt road that led deeper into the Baltic states. 2 days into Operation Barbarossa, and so far, it had been a parade. "Anything, Herr Oberleutnant?" His gunner, Feldwebel Otto Kessler, didn't look up from his own sight. The man had been with Weber since Poland, and he could read tension in silence. "Nothing yet." Weber shifted his weight, feeling the familiar press of the commander's cupola against his shoulders. "Intelligence says the Soviet 3rd Mechanized Corps is somewhere in this sector, probably running already." Kessler snorted. Like everyone else. It was hard to argue. The first 48 hours had been a masterclass in German combined arms warfare. Stukas screaming down on paralyzed Soviet columns, infantry mopping up dazed defenders, and the panzers slicing through whatever remained. Weber's company had knocked out 7 BT tanks and 3 of those lumbering T-34s without taking a single hit. The Soviet machines had been exactly what Wehrmacht intelligence briefings promised: outdated, poorly maintained, crewed by men who barely knew which end of the gun pointed forward. The radio crackled. "Achtung! Movement. 12 o'clock. 700 meters." Weber swung his periscope. There, emerging from a copse of birch trees, something low and angular, then another and another. "Tanks," he said. 5 contacts. Hull down positions." His driver's voice floated up from below. "More T-26? Weber studied the shapes. They were smaller than he expected, but the angles were wrong. Sharper. The turrets looked almost crude, like something hammered together in a factory that had run out of proper tools. One of them was painted in a bizarre camouflage pattern, all hard edges and geometric shapes. "Doesn't matter," Kessler said. "Armor-piercing loaded. Just give me a range." Weber did the math in his head. The Panzer III's 50mm gun could punch through any Soviet armor they'd encountered so far. These looked even thinner than the BT series. 600 meters. Left most target. Fire when ready. The gun barked. Weber watched through the scope as the round sparked off the Soviet tank's hull at a steep angle, leaving nothing but a black scar on green paint. "Hit," Kessler said. "No penetration." Weber blinked. "What?" "No penetration, sir." There was confusion in Kessler's voice now. "Want me to?" The Soviet tank's turret traversed. It moved smoothly, purposefully. Then its gun flashed. The world turned inside out. The round didn't hit Weber's tank. It struck the Panzer III 20 meters to their right, commanded by Lieutenant Braun. The impact was a sound Weber had never heard before. Not the clang of a deflection or the crack of a near miss, but a deep, hollow thum that spoke of metal failing, of armor that simply ceased to exist. Braun's tank shuddered. Smoke began pouring from the turret ring. The hatch flew open, and a man, it might have been Braun, it might have been his gunner, hauled himself out, his uniform on fire. He managed 2 steps before collapsing into the grass. "Reverse! Reverse!" Weber was shouting now, pounding on his driver's shoulder. "Get us out of here!" The Panzer III lurched backward, engine screaming. 2 more Soviet rounds snapped past, close enough that Weber could feel the pressure wave through the open cupola. To his left, another German tank tried to turn, exposing its flank. The result was immediate. A hit just below the turret, and the entire tank seemed to sag, like a puppet with cut strings. "What the hell are those things?" Kessler's voice had gone up an octave. Weber didn't answer. He was too busy watching 5 crude, angular, impossible Soviet tanks roll forward out of the trees, their guns tracking with cold precision. They moved like sharks, slow, inevitable, utterly confident. Behind him, the rest of the company was scattering, pulling back in disorder. The radio was chaos. Shouted warnings, requests for orders, someone screaming about a tank burning with the crew still inside. One of the Soviet tanks crested a small rise, its hull silhouetted against the morning sky. Weber got his first clear look at the whole machine. It was uglier than anything he'd ever seen, slab-sided, with a turret that looked like it had been shaped by a drunk blacksmith. The barrel seemed too long, the chassis too low. Everything about it screamed crude. But it was still coming, and they were still running. Fall back to the village, Weber managed. His mouth was dry. Reform at another hit. This one found the Panzer IV that had been trying to provide covering fire. The round went through the frontal armor like it wasn't even there. Secondary explosion. No survivors. Weber looked at the retreating German tanks, then back at the 5 Soviet machines advancing at their own pace. Unhurried, untroubled. One of them had stopped to fire again, and Weber realized with sick certainty that it was aiming at his tank. "Driver, full reverse, now!" The shell missed by centimeters, kicking up a geyser of dirt where his tank had been a heartbeat earlier. That night, after the survivors had regrouped 12 kilometers west of Rasenii, Weber sat on the ground with his back against his Panzer III's track and tried to write a report. His hand kept shaking. Across the field, Brown's tank was still burning. Kessler approached, carrying 2 canteens. He handed one to Weber without speaking. They drank in silence, watching the smoke rise into the darkening sky. Finally, Kessler said, "Intelligence was wrong." Weber nodded slowly. "Yes." "What do we do?" It was a good question. Weber thought about the crude tank with the too long gun and the armor that shouldn't have worked but did. He thought about how it had moved, calm and purposeful, while German crews that had conquered Poland and France in months scattered like startled birds. "We learn," he said, "or we die." The reports started filtering back to Berlin within a week. At first, they were dismissed as exaggeration, panicked accounts from green crews who'd simply been caught off guard. The Soviet T-34 couldn't possibly be as formidable as frontline officers claimed. The specifications didn't make sense. Sloped armor at extreme angles, a 76.2mm gun, wide tracks for cross-country mobility, and a Christie suspension system that somehow worked despite looking like it had been designed by committee and built by drunks. But the reports kept coming. August 1941, near Smolensk, a battalion of Panzer IIIs engaged what they estimated as a company of T-34s across an open field. Standard doctrine: maneuver for flank shots, concentrate fire, exploit superior German tactics, and crew training. The engagement lasted 18 minutes. 14 German tanks were destroyed or disabled. The Soviets lost 3, and 2 of those were mobility kills from thrown tracks, not penetrations. September 1941. A Panzer IV commander named Hauptmann Ernst Barkmann filed a detailed after-action report that made its way to the Waffenamt, the German Army's weapons development office. He described firing 9 rounds at a single T-34 from 500 meters. 8 deflected off the sloped frontal armor. The 9th hit the turret ring and jammed the turret, but didn't knock the tank out. The T-34 reversed into cover, still operational. Meanwhile, Barkmann's own Panzer IV took a single hit that penetrated the frontal plate and killed his driver. "The slope defeats our shells," he wrote. "It doesn't matter that the armor is only 45 mm thick at the front. The angle makes it effectively 75 mm or more. Our 50 mm guns are inadequate. Our tactics are inadequate. We are firing at geometry, and geometry is winning." In his tent outside Rasenii, Weber read these reports whenever they were passed down through channels. He kept a notebook, unauthorized, probably dangerous if the wrong officer saw it, where he recorded every encounter with T-34s, every tactic that worked, every one that failed. The notebook was filling up fast. October 1941. Weber's company, now rebuilt with replacement tanks and crews, encountered T-34s again outside Vyazma. This time, they knew what to expect. They used buildings for cover, worked in coordinated pairs, aimed for the tracks and turret ring. It worked. Sort of. They knocked out 4 T-34s, but lost 6 Panzers doing it. And the thing that haunted Weber afterward wasn't the combat itself. It was what happened when they examined the destroyed Soviet tanks. Kessler had climbed onto one of the wrecks, prying open the turret hatch to assess the interior. Weber joined him, curious despite himself. What he saw inside made him angry in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The welding was rough, almost crude. The interior was cramped beyond belief. The driver and hull gunner sitting so close their shoulders touched. The turret basket so tight, the crew could barely move. There was no radio in the hull, meaning the commander had to relay everything. The optics were inferior to German equipment. The ammunition storage was a nightmare, rounds scattered in bins without proper protection. The whole thing smelled like diesel and unwashed bodies and desperation. It should have been a death trap. And yet... "Look at this," Kessler said, running his hand along the sloped frontal armor. "It's just flat plates, welded at angles. Nothing fancy. No complex curves like our designs. But it works." Weber studied the armor plate. Kessler was right. German tanks were engineered, precisely calculated angles, carefully machined components, elegant solutions to complex problems. The T-34 looked like someone had drawn a simple diagram and told a factory to build it, fast, with whatever they had. "It's primitive," Weber said. "It's effective," Kessler corrected. "That's different." They found the crew still inside. 3 bodies burned beyond recognition. Weber made himself look at them, made himself remember that these crude machines had real people in them, people who died just as finally as Germans died. One of the bodies still wore a wedding ring. Weber turned away. Back at their assembly area, he added notes to his notebook. "Wide tracks distribute weight. Moves through mud when we bog down. Diesel engine less likely to catch fire than our petrol. Sloped armor is cheap to produce but superior in performance. Gun has better penetration than anything we field at this weight class. They are out-engineering us with simplicity." That last line he underlined twice. November 1941. The winter was setting in early, and with it came a new horror. The T-34's wide tracks and superior ground pressure meant it could move through snow that stopped German tanks cold. Weber watched, helpless, as a platoon of T-34s simply drove around his bogged-down company, firing into flanks and rear armor that couldn't be protected because the German tanks couldn't maneuver. His regiment lost 43 tanks that week. Most of them never fired a shot. The cold killed more than combat. German tanks, engineered for Western European conditions, had to be warmed for hours before their engines would start. T-34s, crude and simple, turned over in minutes. Their diesel fuel didn't gel in the cold. Their wide tracks didn't sink in snow. Their crews, freezing and miserable, could at least move. By December, Weber had seen enough. He filed his own report, knowing it would probably go nowhere, but unable to stay silent. He wrote, "The T-34 is not superior because of any single feature, but because of its design philosophy. It is built for mass production, ease of maintenance, and effectiveness in Russian conditions. We have built technical masterpieces. They have built war machines. At present, we are losing the distinction between those two categories. Recommendations: cease production of Panzer III in current configuration. develop immediate upgrades to Panzer IV main gun, 75 to L-43 minimum. Prioritize sloped armor in all future designs. Most critically, accept that we are not facing an inferior enemy. We are facing a different kind of intelligence, and it is beating us. He sealed the report and sent it up the chain. 3 weeks later, he received a reply from a staff officer in Army Group Center. The message was brief. Your observations are noted. Continue current operations. Winter will slow Soviet tank production. Situation will improve in spring. Weber read the message twice, then burned it in his tent's small stove. That night, he sat with Kessler, both of them wrapped in whatever warm clothing they could scavenge. The temperature had dropped to -30. Outside, mechanics were trying to thaw frozen engines with blowtorches. 3 tanks had already been abandoned because they couldn't be started. We're not going to win this with Panzer IIIs, Kessler said quietly. Weber said nothing. He was thinking about the crude tank with the sloped armor and the long gun. He was thinking about how German engineering, so precise, so carefully calculated, had somehow missed something fundamental. He was thinking about spring and what it would bring. Somewhere in the darkness, a tank engine coughed and died. The mechanics cursed. The cold deepened. And far to the east, in factories that ran 24 hours a day, workers who had never seen a blueprint were building more T-34s. Crude, simple, effective. They were building them by the thousand. Weber closed his notebook and tried to sleep. In the morning, there would be more combat, more learning, more dying. The war was only 6 months old. It felt like it had been forever. Previous section text. Continue seamlessly from where this left off. Section 3. The road to Kursk Spring. 1942 arrived with mud. The Rasputitsa, the season of impassable roads, turned the entire eastern front into a morass of liquid earth that swallowed vehicles whole. Weber's company spent 6 weeks in the same position outside Rzhev, not because of Soviet resistance, but because moving anywhere meant losing half your tanks to ground that had the consistency of soup. The T-34s moved anyway. Weber watched them through his binoculars, operating on roads that shouldn't have existed, crossing terrain that had stopped his entire regiment. Their wide tracks, those crude-looking things that German engineers had dismissed as unsophisticated, spread their weight across twice the surface area of a Panzer III. What looked like primitive design was revealed again as genius disguised as simplicity. But something was changing in the German response. New tanks were arriving at the front. The Panzer IV Ausf F2 came with a long-barreled 75mm gun, the L-43 that could finally punch through T-34 frontal armor at combat ranges. It wasn't enough to restore parity, but it was something. Weber's company received 3 of them in May. He gave them to his most experienced crews and told them to stay at range, to use the superior German optics and crew training to strike first. It worked sometimes. The kill ratios improved from catastrophic to merely bad. Intelligence reports filtering through headquarters told a broader story. The T-34 was being produced in numbers that defied German comprehension. Tank factories had been evacuated east of the Urals, beyond Luftwaffe range. Places called Tankograd and Chelyabinsk were churning out T-34s at rates that made German production look artisanal. Where Germany built tanks with precision and care, the Soviets built them with brutal efficiency, accepting crude welds and rough finishes in exchange for sheer volume. And volume, Weber was learning, had a quality all its own. Summer 1942. The German army surged south toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. Weber's division was pulled from the central sector and sent south, part of the massive redeployment that would define the summer campaign. The T-34s came south too, always present, always dangerous, but now facing German tanks that could at least fight back on approaching equal terms. Except equal terms weren't enough. The Soviets didn't need parity. They had quantity. For every T-34 knocked out, 2 more appeared. German crews fought with skill and courage and desperation, and still the mathematics of attrition ground them down. Weber lost Kessler in August outside Kalak. A T-34 they hadn't seen, hidden in a destroyed building, fired once. The shell penetrated the Panzer IV's side armor and turned the interior into an inferno. Weber pulled Kessler from the burning tank himself, but the man died before the medics arrived. His last words were about his wife in Hamburg, and whether Weber would write to her. Weber wrote the letter. He didn't mention that Kessler had burned to death, or that he'd screamed, or that the T-34 that killed him had escaped while Weber tried to save his gunner. He wrote about courage and duty and quick deaths that probably hadn't hurt. He signed it and sealed it and hated himself for lying. The new gunner was a kid named Fischer, 19 years old, fresh from training. He was competent but terrified, and Weber couldn't blame him. By September, everyone was terrified. Winter 1942-43. Stalingrad fell, and with it, an entire German army. The Eastern Front, which had been a story of German advance punctuated by Soviet resistance, became something else. A grinding, desperate struggle where every kilometer cost blood and metal in quantities that couldn't be sustained. The Panzer forces, once the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, were being bled white. Weber's company had started Barbarossa with 12 tanks. By January 1943, he had 4 operational vehicles and 7 men he could trust in combat. The rest were replacements, boys mostly, who knew how to drive and shoot, but not how to survive. And still the T-34s came. But so did something else. February 1943, Weber's regiment was pulled back to Kharkov for rest and refit. While there, he saw the new tanks that were supposed to change everything. The Panzer V Panther, sleek, modern, with sloped armor that finally matched the T-34's geometry, and a long 75mm gun that could kill any Soviet tank at range. And the Tiger Y, massive and intimidating, with frontal armor so thick that T-34 shells bounced off harmlessly. Weber walked around a Tiger, studying it with the eye of someone who'd spent 2 years fighting Soviet tanks. It was impressive, no question. The 88mm gun was a monster. The armor was formidable, but it was also complicated, heavy, prone to mechanical issues. It was everything the T-34 wasn't, a triumph of engineering over simplicity, precision over mass production. "Think it'll make a difference?" Fischer asked. The young gunner looked at the Tiger like a child viewing a fantasy. Weber thought about the factories beyond the Urals, the production lines that never stopped. He thought about the thousands of T-34s already built and the thousands more being assembled. He thought about geometry and angles and the brutal mathematics of attrition. "It'll make a difference," he said finally, "just not enough of one." Spring 1943. The mud returned, and with it, planning for what would be the largest tank battle in history. German High Command had chosen a target. The Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet lines that invited attack from north and south. The plan was simple: pinch off the salient, encircle the Soviet forces inside, and restore initiative to the German army. Operation Citadel, the last great German offensive in the east. Weber's regiment received the briefing in May. They would be part of Army Group South's thrust, driving north from Belgorod toward Kursk itself. Intelligence estimated moderate Soviet resistance. Some T-34s, defensive positions, nothing that German armor and tactical superiority couldn't overcome. Weber listened to the briefing and said nothing. He'd heard these estimates before. He'd been hearing them since Barbarossa, and they'd been wrong every single time. After the briefing, he pulled out his notebook. Now on its 3rd volume, the earlier ones filled cover to cover with observations and tactical notes. He wrote, July 1943, Kursk. We are attacking a prepared Soviet defense with tanks they've had 2 years to learn how to destroy. We have better machines now, Panthers and Tigers that can match the T-34. But they have more. They always have more. The mathematics haven't changed. We are still trying to win with quality against quantity, and quantity keeps finding ways to win. The T-34 is no longer surprising. We understand its strengths and weaknesses. We know how to fight it. But knowing how to fight something and having the resources to do it are different things. We are going to Kursk with the best tanks we've ever fielded, the best crews, the best tactics, and I think we are going to lose anyway. He closed the notebook and looked at his company. 4 tanks, 16 men, all of them veterans now if they'd survived this long. They were good. Probably the best he'd ever commanded. They knew their machines, knew their enemy, knew how to survive in a war that killed almost everyone eventually. It wasn't going to be enough. July 4th, 1943. The night before the offensive, Weber stood beside his Panzer IV and watched the sun set over the Russian steppe. The air smelled like diesel and summer grass, and the particular tension that came before major combat. Around him, the entire German army seemed to be coiled like a spring, waiting for the order to advance. Fischer approached, carrying Weber's helmet. "Sir, they're saying this is it, the big one, that after Kursk, the war turns our way again." Weber took the helmet, turning it over in his hands. He thought about all the other times they'd been told the war was about to turn. Poland, France, Moscow, Stalingrad. The promises kept getting repeated, and the reality kept getting worse. "Maybe," he said, because there was nothing else to say. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in his tank, reading his notebooks by flashlight, reviewing every lesson he'd learned about fighting T-34s, every tactic, every angle, every weakness. He'd become an expert in killing the machines that had nearly killed him a dozen times over. Tomorrow, he'd find out if expertise mattered against an enemy that could afford to lose 10 tanks for every one of theirs that survived. The clock ticked toward midnight, then past it. July 5th, 1943. In a few hours, Operation Citadel would begin. Somewhere ahead, in the darkness, the T-34s were waiting. July 5th, 1943. It's 4:30 hours. Belgorod sector. The artillery barrage began before dawn, a rolling thunder that shook the earth and turned the eastern horizon into a wall of flame. Weber felt it through the hull of his Panzer IV, a physical vibration that made his teeth ache. Beside him, Fischer was pale but steady, his hands already on the gun controls. "All units," the radio crackled. "Advance on my command. Maintain formation. Watch for anti-tank positions." Weber pressed his eye to the periscope. Through the pre-dawn murk and smoke, he could see the shapes of other tanks rolling forward. Panzer IIIs like his own, the sleek profiles of new Panthers, and farther back, the massive Tigers. The largest concentration of German armor ever assembled, moving as one toward the Soviet lines. It should have been glorious. It felt like driving into a furnace. "Driver forward. Speed, 15 kilometers per hour. Fischer, load armor piercing. Watch the ridgeline at 2 o'clock. The Panzer IIIs lurched into motion, tracks biting into the summer earth. Around them, the entire division was moving, a steel avalanche that nothing should have been able to stop. The artillery had lifted, leaving behind a landscape of craters and burning grass. Somewhere ahead, the Soviet defenses waited. They didn't have to wait long. 5:20 hours. The first Soviet shells arrived not from the front, but from the flanks. Hidden batteries that had somehow survived the bombardment opened up with withering accuracy. A Panther 50 meters to Weber's left took a direct hit to the turret, not from a tank, but from artillery. The explosion was catastrophic. The tank kept rolling forward for another 20 meters, already burning, before grinding to a halt. Contact front, someone screamed over the radio. T-34s, multiple contacts. Weber swung his periscope forward. There, emerging from prepared positions that intelligence had sworn weren't there, dozens of T-34s. Not scattered or panicked, but organized, hull down, their guns already tracking German targets. The mathematics of Kursk began. Fischer fired first, his round striking a T-34 at 800 meters. The shell hit the sloped frontal armor and deflected upward, leaving a scar but no penetration. The T-34's gun flashed in return. The shell missed Weber's tank by inches, close enough that he felt the heat of its passage. Traverse left. Target the one behind the berm. Aim for the turret ring. Fischer adjusted. Fired. This time the round hit true, punching into the gap between turret and hull. The T-34 shuddered and stopped, smoke pouring from its hatches. But 3 more were already moving to replace it, and behind them, Weber could see more shapes emerging from concealed positions. How many? The intelligence brief had said maybe 50 Soviet tanks in this sector. Weber could see twice that already, and the battle was barely 10 minutes old. A Tiger rumbled past on Weber's right, its massive gun firing with methodical precision. Each shot destroyed a T-34, the 88 mm gun punching through Soviet armor like paper. But for every T-34 that died, Soviet gunners were learning the Tiger's weak points. Weber watched as concentrated fire from 3 T-34s hammered a Tiger's tracks, immobilizing it. The Tiger kept fighting, its turret traversing to kill its attackers, but it was stuck. A target. Within minutes, more T-34s would flank it, find the side armor, finish it. That was the pattern emerging. The German tanks were better, individually superior in almost every way. Better optics, better crew training, better armor, better guns. But the Soviets had turned Kursk into a killing ground, where individual superiority didn't matter. They'd had 2 months to prepare, and they'd used every day. Joe 6-15 hours. Weber's company had advanced 3 kilometers in 90 minutes, and already he'd lost 2 tanks. The Panzer IV, commanded by Lieutenant Hoffmann, had taken a hit to the engine compartment. Mobility kill. The crew escaped, but the tank was abandoned, burning. Hauptmann Richter's tank had hit a mine, blowing off its tracks and leaving it stranded. Richter was trying to fight from a static position, but Weber could see T-34s maneuvering to flank him. All units press forward, maintain momentum, do not stop. The order came from regiment, from some officer kilometers behind the line, who was watching colored markers on a map instead of the actual battlefield. Weber wanted to scream at them that momentum was meaningless when every kilometer forward revealed another belt of defenses, another concentration of T-34s, another field of mines that intelligence had somehow missed. Instead, he said, "Driver, follow the Tigers. Stay in their wake. Fischer, watch our flanks." They pushed forward. The Tigers were creating a path, their weight and armor allowing them to bulldoze through Soviet positions that would have stopped lighter tanks. Weber followed in their shadow, using their mass as mobile cover. It was the only tactic that worked. Let the heavy tanks absorb the punishment while the medium panzers exploited the gaps. But there were never enough Tigers, and the gaps kept closing. 745 hours. The sun was fully up now, beating down on metal that was already hot from firing and engine heat and the general inferno of mechanized combat. Weber's uniform was soaked with sweat. Fischer had already gone through 2 canteens. The driver was reporting engine temperature rising into the red zone. They'd been running hard for 3 hours without pause. "Contact! Left flank! T-34s closing fast!" Weber spun his periscope. 4 T-34s had emerged from a tree line, moving at speed, angling for the German formation's left side. They were using terrain brilliantly, staying in dead ground, appearing only long enough to fire, then disappearing again. "Traverse left. Target lead tank." Fischer was already moving, the turret whining as it rotated. He fired. Hit. The T-34's track disintegrated, sending the tank slewing sideways, but its gun was still operational, and it fired even as it lost mobility. The shot went wide, but it forced Weber's driver to jink hard right, almost colliding with another Panzer IV. The second T-34 fired. This shot didn't miss. The impact sounded like the world ending, a massive metallic crash that lifted Weber off his feet and slammed him against the turret wall. His vision went white, then red, then slowly cleared. Smoke was pouring into the fighting compartment. Something was on fire. Someone was screaming. "Out! Everyone out!" Weber grabbed Fischer. The young gunner was conscious but dazed, blood running from his nose, and hauled him toward the turret hatch. The driver was already climbing out through his own hatch, moving with the desperate speed of a man who knew he had seconds before ammunition cooked off. They hit the ground and ran. 10 meters. 20. The Panzer IV exploded behind them, the ammunition finally reaching critical temperature. The blast wave knocked Weber flat, drove the air from his lungs, left him gasping in the dirt while pieces of his tank, his home for 2 years, rained down around him. Fischer was beside him, alive. The driver, Weber couldn't remember his name, the man was a replacement from last month, was crawling toward a shell crater. All 3 of them made it. They lay there gasping, while the battle rolled over and past them. Weber raised his head enough to see the battlefield. It was chaos. Burning tanks, both German and Soviet, littered the landscape like discarded toys. A Panther was hull down in a crater, its gun still firing, surrounded by 3 destroyed T-34s, but taking fire from 5 more. A Tiger had penetrated deep into Soviet lines, but was now surrounded, fighting in all directions simultaneously, its armor holding but its ammunition surely running low. And still the T-34s came. They emerged from concealed positions that shouldn't have existed. They counterattacked from flanks that were supposed to be secure. They died in dozens. The German kill ratio was probably 3 or 4 to 1. But there were always more. Always. The Soviets were spending T-34s like ammunition, trading metal and lives for time and position, and the slow, grinding destruction of German offensive capability. A Soviet infantryman appeared at the crater's edge, rifle raised. Weber reached for his pistol, but Fischer was faster. He'd kept his submachine gun, and he fired a burst that sent the Soviet soldier tumbling backward. 2 more appeared. The driver threw a grenade. The explosion bought them seconds. "We need to fall back," Fischer said. His voice was shaking. "Sir, we need to—" "I know." They crawled backward, using shell craters for cover, while the battle raged above them. A Panzer IV, it might have been from Weber's own company, drove past, trailing smoke, its commander's cupola empty. Another T-34 burned nearby, its crew bail out and running toward Soviet lines. German infantry were mixed into the chaos now, trying to secure ground that the tanks had taken but couldn't hold. It took them 4 hours to make it back to German lines. By then, the offensive had stalled. The massive armored thrust that was supposed to break through Soviet defenses had gained 15 kilometers and lost a third of its strength doing it. Weber sat in a field hospital, being treated for burns and concussion, and listened to the reports coming in. The northern pincer of the offensive had it worse. Barely any progress, catastrophic losses. The Panthers, those beautiful new tanks that were supposed to change everything, were breaking down from mechanical issues. The Tigers were being swarmed and destroyed. The T-34s were everywhere, and behind them were more. Newer models, better gunners, improved tactics. Fischer sat beside him, his face bandaged. "We're not going to make it to Kursk, are we?" Weber thought about the geometry of the battle, the prepared defenses, the overlapping fields of fire, the sheer numerical superiority that let the Soviets trade losses they could afford for time Germany didn't have. He thought about how the crude, simple T-34 had evolved from a shock weapon into the backbone of a defensive strategy that was eating German armor alive. "No," he said. "We're not." July 12, 1943. 7 days into the offensive, Operation Citadel was called off. The Germans had failed to break through. The largest tank battle in history had become a graveyard where Panthers and Tigers lay burning beside the T-34s they'd been built to destroy. The crude Soviet tank had won again. Not through technological superiority, but through the same qualities it had always possessed: simplicity, mass production, and a design philosophy that prioritized winning over perfection. The Panzers had laughed at it once, in the early days of Barbarossa. Nobody was laughing anymore.